Racist cop arrests black woman. Unaware, she's the federal analyst tracing every falsified report he submitted. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Officer Daniel Crow had been on patrol for nearly a decade, long enough to believe he understood how the streets worked, and long enough to think he understood people, or at least the kinds of people he expected to encounter on a quiet weekday afternoon. The sky over the city hung low and gray, the kind of overcast that made everything feel heavier than it was, and Daniel cruised down Maple Avenue at exactly 30 miles per hour, confident, unhurried, his dashboard clock ticking toward the end of his shift. That was when he noticed Alyssa Monroe walking along the sidewalk, her pace steady, her posture composed, a simple shoulder bag resting against her side. To Daniel, she looked like someone who didn't belong in his mental picture of the neighborhood, and that assumption settled in his mind before any facts did. He slowed, watched her for a few seconds, and made a decision that felt routine to him, the kind he had made countless times without ever questioning why. Alyssa noticed the cruiser pull alongside her, but she didn't flinch or change her pace. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly invited attention, and attention often came with assumptions she couldn't control. Daniel stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with practiced confidence, his voice calm but clipped as he asked standard questions that carried more weight than their words suggested. Alyssa answered politely, clearly, never raising her voice, never offering more than was asked. Around them, traffic continued. A delivery truck rolled by, and a couple across the street pretended not to notice. To Daniel, her calm felt suspicious, like a challenge, and the longer the exchange went on, the more certain he became that he was in control. He asked for identification, glanced at it briefly, then looked past her, as if searching for something that would justify the tone he had already chosen. Alyssa stood still, eyes forward, memorizing details without appearing to try. The badge number on his chest, the faint scuff on his left boot, the way his body camera light blinked steadily, recording everything. Daniel informed her she was being detained pending further verification, his words rehearsed, his confidence unshaken. He believed paperwork could make any story official, that once something was written down, it became truth. Alyssa nodded, accepting the moment without argument, because she understood something Daniel did not, that truth didn't begin or end with a single report. As they moved toward the cruiser, Daniel felt the familiar reassurance of authority, unaware that every step he took echoed through a system far larger than the one he thought he controlled. Alyssa took a slow breath, already connecting patterns in her mind, because long before this afternoon, long before Maple Avenue, she had been tracing inconsistencies, altered timestamps, and rewritten narratives, and one name had kept appearing in places it shouldn't have. Daniel Crow believed this was just another stop, another line in a report he would finalize before dinner. But for Alyssa Monroe, this moment was simply the beginning of a story that had been unfolding quietly for months, one where every detail mattered and every assumption would eventually be tested. The ride to the precinct was quiet, broken only by the soft hum of tires against asphalt and the steady tick of the turn signal as Officer Daniel Crow guided the cruiser through familiar streets he had driven thousands of times before. To him, the station was a place of certainty, a building where questions stopped and reports became official records. And as he pulled into the lot, he felt the comfort of routine settle back into his shoulders. Alyssa Monroe sat calmly in the back seat, her gaze drifting past the window as storefronts and street signs slid by, her expression neutral, her breathing slow and controlled. She counted intersections without moving her lips, noted the time on the dash clock, and listened to the faint radio chatter filtering through the front speakers, small fragments of other officers' voices weaving into a pattern she had learned to decode. Inside the station, fluorescent lights washed the hallway in pale white, and the familiar smell of coffee and paper lingered in the air. Daniel signed in with a quick motion, nodding to a colleague who barely looked up, then led Alyssa to a waiting area where the chairs were bolted to the floor and the walls were lined with faded posters about procedures and compliance. To Daniel, it was just another administrative stop, another moment where he would type a few lines, select a drop-down reason, and move on with his day. He believed details could always be adjusted later, smoothed out, or clarified if anyone ever asked. An experience had taught him that no one usually did. Alyssa took a seat, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes quietly scanning the room, taking in the security cameras positioned at the corners, the small digital clock mounted above a door, and the rhythm of footsteps passing by. She listened as Daniel spoke to a desk officer, his tone casual, almost bored, as he summarized the situation in a way that sounded complete without actually saying much at all. From where she sat, Alyssa could hear the keys clicking as he began to type, each keystroke another mark added to a system that believed itself to be objective. She thought about the spreadsheet she had studied late at night, rows of data that told stories no one had intended to tell, patterns that emerged only when someone bothered to look closely enough. Names repeated, timestamps shifted by minutes, narratives that changed just enough to align with expectations, and among them, Daniel Crow had become familiar long before she had ever seen his face. Daniel glanced back at her once, briefly, noting her composure, and mistook it for resignation. He assumed silence meant acceptance, that compliance meant agreement, and that the process was unfolding exactly as it always had. He did not notice the way Alyssa's eyes paused on his name displayed on the monitor, nor did he sense the quiet weight of recognition settling into place. As minutes passed, the station continued its routine. Phones rang, printers whirred, and officers moved in and out of rooms without a second glance, each confident that the system worked because it always had. Alyssa remained still, understanding that patience was not weakness but timing, and that sometimes the most important work happened long before anyone realized a line had been crossed. Daniel finished typing, saved the report, and leaned back in his chair, satisfied that everything was in order, unaware that somewhere beyond the walls of the precinct, a much larger picture was already forming, one that did not rely on assumptions, but on records that could not be erased once they were finally seen for what they were. Time moved differently inside the station, measured not by urgency, but by procedure, and as the afternoon edged toward evening, Officer Daniel Crow felt certain the situation was already behind him. He stood near the counter, chatting with another officer about weekend plans, his voice relaxed, his posture loose, confident that nothing about this stop would follow him home. Alyssa Monroe remained seated where she had been left, her attention seemingly unfocused, yet every sound in the room registered clearly in her mind. She listened to the rhythm of the building, the way conversations dipped when supervisors walked by, the way certain names were spoken more carefully than others. She knew these patterns well, not from experience inside stations like this, but from data that revealed behavior long before it became visible. Daniel eventually returned, holding a printed form, explaining the next steps in a tone that suggested finality, as if his words alone could close the matter. He believed the explanation was sufficient, that compliance was all that mattered, and that the system did not require deeper scrutiny. Alyssa nodded again, acknowledging without conceding, because she understood the difference between listening and agreeing. As Daniel stepped away to make a phone call, Alyssa's thoughts drifted to a secure office miles away, where screens glowed late into the night, and analysts worked quietly, following threads that others overlooked. She remembered the first time she had noticed the anomalies, how a series of reports from different months shared identical phrasing, how timestamps aligned too neatly, how corrections always favored the same outcomes. At first, it looked like coincidence, but coincidence rarely repeated itself with such precision. Daniel Crow had been one of several names flagged, not because of a single incident, but because of consistency, the kind that revealed intent when viewed over time. Back in the station, a supervisor glanced at the report on the screen, skimmed it quickly, and nodded without comment, reinforcing Daniel's belief that everything was routine. That nod carried weight, a silent approval that allowed the process to continue uninterrupted. Alyssa watched the exchange carefully, noting how easily authority passed from one person to another, reinforced by habit rather than verification. She thought about how trust, once assumed, became invisible, and how invisible things were often the hardest to challenge. Daniel returned to her, his expression neutral, informing her that the matter would be reviewed and that she would be contacted if further information was needed. To him, it was closure, another task completed before the end of his shift. To Alyssa, it was confirmation, another data point aligning perfectly with what she already knew. As she stood, adjusting the strap of her bag, she felt the quiet certainty that had guided her work for years settle firmly in place. This was not about confrontation or correction in the moment, but about allowing the process to reveal itself fully. Daniel watched her leave, barely registering her departure beyond a fleeting sense of satisfaction, convinced that order had been maintained. Outside, the air had cooled, the sky beginning to darken as streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating the sidewalk where Alyssa paused briefly before continuing on her way. She took out her phone, not to make a call, but to check the time, aligning it with a mental timeline she had been building for months. Somewhere within that timeline, today's events fit exactly where they were supposed to, and while Daniel Crow believed his report would settle quietly into a digital archive, Alyssa knew that archives had a way of speaking when someone finally listened closely enough. The following days unfolded with deceptive normalcy, and for Officer Daniel Crow, life settled back into its familiar rhythm: early mornings, routine patrols, and paperwork that blended together until each shift felt indistinguishable from the last. He joked with colleagues, reviewed reports, and moved through the station with the ease of someone who believed he had nothing to hide. Yet beneath that routine, subtle disruptions began to surface, small enough to dismiss at first, but persistent enough to register as irritation. A request for clarification arrived from records, asking about a minor inconsistency in a previous report. Then another email followed, this one from internal review, politely phrased but unusually specific. Daniel brushed them off, confident that explanations could be supplied if needed, and reminded himself that reviews happened all the time without consequence. Across town, Alyssa Monroe sat at a clean desk in a secured office, her screen filled with lines of data that told stories far more clearly than memory ever could. She worked methodically, aligning timestamps, comparing language patterns, and linking entries that shared more than coincidence. Her calm expression never changed, even as the picture sharpened, revealing how certain reports have been adjusted just enough to redirect outcomes without raising alarms. The incident on Maple Avenue now sat neatly within that framework, another example of how assumptions became official narratives when no one questioned them. Back at the station, Daniel noticed that supervisors were asking more questions during briefings, not accusatory, but thorough, and he felt a tightening in his chest he could not quite explain. He assured himself that thoroughness was a sign of diligence, not suspicion, and continued to rely on the confidence that had carried him through years of similar moments. Alyssa compiled her findings into a preliminary analysis, careful to let the data speak for itself, avoiding conclusions that could be dismissed as opinion. She knew escalation did not come from confrontation, but from clarity, and clarity required patience. As the week progressed, Daniel was asked to review older cases, ones he barely remembered, and he complied, telling himself that memory faded for everyone. Yet each request chipped away at his sense of control, replacing certainty with an unease he could not name. Alyssa attended a quiet meeting with colleagues who spoke in measured tones, discussing trends rather than individuals, and she listened more than she spoke, aware that timing mattered as much as evidence. Names were mentioned, including Daniel Crow's, not with judgment, but as part of a broader pattern that demanded attention. Back in the patrol car, Daniel stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror for a moment longer than usual, unsettled by the feeling that something unseen was moving closer. He reminded himself that he had always followed procedure, that reports were interpretations of events, not transcripts, and that interpretation left room for judgment. Alyssa, reviewing the final alignment of data points late one evening, felt the quiet confirmation that comes when uncertainty falls away. The system she worked within did not rush, did not accuse, and did not forget. It simply waited until the accumulation of facts became impossible to ignore. By the time Daniel received notice of a formal audit, he still believed it was a formality, another hurdle he would clear as he always had. He did not realize that the ground beneath his confidence had already shifted, not because of a single moment, but because every moment he thought insignificant had been carefully preserved, examined, and understood in a context far beyond his own perspective. Alyssa closed her laptop, satisfied that the next phase would proceed without her needing to intervene further, knowing that the most effective confrontations were often the ones that arrived quietly, backed not by accusation, but by undeniable truth. The audit did not arrive with sirens or announcements, but with a calendar invite that appeared in Officer Daniel Crow's inbox late on a Tuesday afternoon, its subject line neutral, its tone professional, and its implications easy to underestimate. He told himself it was routine, another administrative review that would pass as quietly as it came, yet the timing unsettled him, aligning too neatly with the recent questions and requests that had begun to accumulate. At roll call the next morning, he noticed a shift in the room. Conversation softer, eyes lingering a moment longer than usual, and while no one said his name aloud, he felt it hovering just beneath the surface. Daniel focused on the familiar motions of the day, checking equipment, reviewing assignments, reminding himself that consistency had always been his ally. Across the city, Alyssa Monroe sat in a conference room where the walls were bare and the table was long, listening as a senior analyst summarized findings with deliberate restraint. Alyssa recognized the discipline in the delivery, the way conclusions were allowed to emerge naturally from evidence rather than being forced into place. Her role was nearly complete, yet she remained attentive, understanding that precision at this stage mattered more than speed. The Maple Avenue stop appeared briefly on a screen, not dramatized, simply contextualized among dozens of other entries, its significance clear without explanation. Back at the station, Daniel was asked to provide supplemental documentation, copies of reports, and clarifications on wording that suddenly seemed more important than they ever had before. He complied, reassuring himself that language was flexible, that intent could be inferred, and that oversight did not automatically imply wrongdoing. Still, the act of revisiting old files stirred an unease he could not suppress, as if the past were less settled than he had believed. Alyssa reviewed the supplemental materials when they arrived, noting how explanations attempted to smooth over discrepancies without addressing their source. She marked sections quietly, not as accusations, but as points requiring verification, aware that patterns revealed themselves most clearly when left unchallenged. Daniel began to sense the narrowing of options, the way casual confidence gave way to careful phrasing, and he found himself rehearsing explanations during his commute, refining narratives that once came effortlessly. He reminded himself that experience counted for something, that years on the force earned a measure of trust, yet he could not shake the feeling that trust was no longer enough. Alyssa met with a legal liaison to confirm procedural thresholds, ensuring that every step taken adhered strictly to protocol, because legitimacy depended on process as much as outcome. The conversation was brief, efficient, and decisive, signaling that the review had reached a point of no return. When Daniel received notice of a formal interview, his initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a resolve to present himself as he always had, calm, cooperative, and certain. He arrived early, dressed neatly, convinced that professionalism would speak louder than suspicion. Alyssa, informed that the next phase had begun, closed her files and set them aside, knowing that her presence was no longer required for the system to continue its work. As Daniel waited in a small conference room, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of the station carrying on without him, he felt the weight of accumulated moments press in, not as accusations, but as questions he could no longer control. Alyssa stepped out into the evening light, confident that the truth, once assembled with care, did not need to announce itself to be heard. The interview began without ceremony. A small conference room, a recorder placed neatly on the table, and two officials seated across from Officer Daniel Crow with expressions that were professional rather than hostile. Daniel answered the initial questions easily, his voice steady, his posture upright, drawing on years of experience that had taught him how to speak without saying too much. He framed his responses carefully, emphasizing procedure, judgment, and context, confident that ambiguity had always worked in his favor. As the questions progressed, however, their tone shifted, not sharper, but more precise, each one narrowing the space for interpretation. Dates were mentioned, then report numbers, then exact phrasing pulled from documents he remembered writing but had not revisited in years. Daniel felt a tightening behind his ribs as he realized they were not asking to learn, but to confirm. Somewhere else, Alyssa Monroe sat in a quiet office, reviewing a final cross-reference, watching as the system aligned entries she had flagged months earlier. She did not smile or celebrate, because for her this moment was not about victory, but about completion. The work had always been about accuracy, about ensuring that truth could stand on its own without embellishment. Back in the conference room, Daniel was asked about the Maple Avenue stop, presented not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern. He explained it the way he always had, emphasizing compliance and discretion, but the officials listened without reacting, already familiar with his narrative. They referenced internal logs, body camera activation times, and minor edits that appeared consistently across multiple reports. Daniel realized then that the conversation was no longer under his control, that every answer he gave had already been weighed against something immutable. Alyssa received a brief update from a colleague, confirming that thresholds had been met and that oversight had been elevated beyond a local level. She closed her file slowly, aware that her name would soon surface, not as a participant in a single event, but as the analyst who had followed the trail to its conclusion. In the interview room, Daniel was offered a chance to review compiled materials, and as he scanned the pages, he recognized his own words arranged in a way he had never seen before, aligned side by side, stripped of context, and measured against one another. The familiarity of his language, once reassuring, now felt foreign, revealing repetition he had never intended anyone to notice. He asked if this meant disciplinary action, his tone controlled, and the response was careful, emphasizing process rather than outcome. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Alyssa prepared a brief summary for leadership, not naming individuals unnecessarily, focusing instead on systemic implications, because accountability, she knew, was most effective when it addressed structure as well as behavior. Daniel left the interview with a polite handshake and no immediate resolution, but the absence of closure weighed heavily as he walked through the station, aware that conversations seemed to pause as he passed. For the first time, the building that had always represented authority felt unfamiliar, its walls less solid than he remembered. Alyssa stepped away from her desk, knowing her involvement was complete, confident that the record she had followed so carefully would now speak for themselves. As Daniel drove home that evening, the city lights blurred past his windshield, and he replayed the interview in his mind, searching for missteps, realizing too late that the story he had told for years was no longer the only version being heard. The revelation did not come in the form Daniel Crow had imagined, not as an accusation shouted across a room, but as a simple statement delivered during a follow-up meeting scheduled without explanation. He sat at the same table as before, hands folded, posture careful, when a new official entered, introduced briefly, and placed a thin folder on the table between them. The official spoke calmly, explaining that the review had crossed a threshold requiring federal coordination, and that an external analyst had been involved from the beginning. Daniel listened, nodding, trying to appear unaffected, until a name was spoken, Alyssa Monroe. The sound of it landed differently this time, no longer attached to a routine stop or a quiet waiting area, but to a role he had not anticipated. The official clarified that Alyssa was a federal analyst assigned to trace inconsistencies across multiple jurisdictions, someone whose work focused on identifying falsified documentation patterns rather than individual incidents. Daniel felt the room narrow, his earlier confidence giving way to a sharp clarity as he understood that the woman he had dismissed as inconsequential had been observing him with an entirely different purpose. The official continued, describing how Alyssa's analysis had linked several reports authored by Daniel, including the Maple Avenue stop, into a timeline that demonstrated repeated adjustments favoring predetermined outcomes. There was no judgment in the tone, only explanation, as if the facts required no embellishment. Daniel stared at the folder, recognizing the precision of the process, realizing that his actions had been contextualized far beyond his control. Across town, Alyssa Monroe sat in a federal building with windows overlooking a quiet street, listening to a brief update confirming that her identity had been disclosed as part of standard procedure. She accepted the information without reaction because anonymity had never been the goal, only accuracy. She reflected briefly on the first moment she had seen Daniel's name surface in the data, how it had stood out not for severity, but for consistency, the kind that suggested habit rather than accident. Back in the meeting, Daniel asked a single question, his voice steady despite the weight behind it, asking how long the analysis had been ongoing. The answer was measured, spanning months rather than days, and with it came the realization that his perception of control had been an illusion sustained by time rather than truth. The official explained that Alyssa's presence during the stop had been incidental, not staged, yet her observations had aligned seamlessly with existing findings, reinforcing conclusions already forming. Daniel nodded again, absorbing the implications, understanding that this was not about one encounter, but about a pattern now visible from a vantage point he had never considered. Alyssa reviewed final documentation confirming the transition of the into into a broader review, her role shifting from investigator to witness, not because she sought confrontation, but because transparency required acknowledgement. Daniel left the meeting quietly, walking through corridors that now felt exposed, every surface reflecting a reality he had ignored. Alyssa closed her file one last time, aware that her work had reached its intended conclusion, trusting that the system, when confronted with undeniable clarity, would respond as designed. Daniel paused outside the building, the air cool against his face, realizing that the truth had not arrived loudly, but it had arrived completely, reshaping everything he thought he understood about authority, oversight, and the cost of assuming no one was watching. The consequences unfolded with a quiet finality that left no room for negotiation, and Officer Daniel Crow felt them not as a single moment, but as a series of confirmations that arrived one after another, each reinforcing the last. An official notice outlined temporary suspension pending final determination, its language formal and restrained, offering no judgment, only process. Daniel read it twice, absorbing the reality that his authority was no longer assumed, that access he once took for granted had been paused by mechanisms he could not override. At the station, his badge was logged, his equipment accounted for, and his assignments reassigned without ceremony, the routine efficiency of the system moving forward without him. Colleagues offered polite nods, brief expressions of support, but conversations remained careful, measured, as if everyone understood that distance was now necessary. Daniel drove home in silence, the absence of a radio crackle emphasizing the shift more than any words could have. He replayed past moments, not searching for innocence, but for understanding, realizing that familiarity had dulled his awareness of accountability. Across the city, Alyssa Monroe received confirmation that the review had advanced into formal action, her analysis now part of a documented record that would inform decisions beyond any single department. She did not feel satisfaction or relief, only a steady sense that the work had reached its intended function. Her role transitioned seamlessly, as it always did, from active investigation to support, ensuring that findings were preserved accurately for those responsible for oversight. Public records reflected the change, without commentary, noting administrative leave and procedural review, phrased carefully to respect due process. Daniel noticed the shift in how time passed. Days no longer structured by shifts and briefings, but by waiting by updates that arrived when they arrived. He attended a follow-up session where policies were reviewed, expectations clarified, and future steps outlined without emotion. Listening, he understood that the system did not seek to punish, but to correct, and that correction often felt like loss to those accustomed to control. Alyssa continued her work, her days filled with new datasets, new patterns, and new responsibilities, aware that the integrity of the process depended on consistency regardless of outcome. She reflected briefly on the Maple Avenue stop, not as a defining moment, but as a convergence point where data and experience aligned perfectly. Daniel received final notice weeks later, detailing findings supported by documentation, language precise and exhaustive, leaving no space for reinterpretation. The conclusion emphasized accountability through established channels, underscoring that trust, once compromised, required more than reassurance to restore. Daniel acknowledged receipt, recognizing that acknowledgement was no longer optional, but required. Alyssa reviewed the closing summary, confirming that all references were accurate, all sources properly cited, and all conclusions derived solely from evidence. She signed off without flourish, knowing that the strength of the outcome rested in its restraint. Daniel packed away items from his locker under supervision, each object a reminder of a role he once believed permanent. Alyssa stepped into the evening air after another long day, her path unchanged, her purpose steady, trusting that when systems functioned as intended, justice did not need to announce itself loudly to be real. Daniel stood outside the station one last time, understanding that the cost of assumptions was not immediate, but cumulative, and that the truth, once assembled with care, had a way of settling matters completely. The story did not end with applause or headlines, but with a quiet recalibration of lives moving forward under new understanding. Months after the review concluded, the city continued as it always had, streets busy, routines intact, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. Daniel Crow now moved through his days without the uniform that once defined him, his mornings no longer shaped by briefings or patrol routes, but by reflection. He took a position far removed from authority, one that required accountability without assumption. And while the adjustment was humbling, it forced him to confront patterns he had never examined before. He began to understand how certainty, left unchecked, could become blindness, and how repetition could disguise intent until intent no longer felt intentional at all. Conversations with former colleagues were rare and measured, but when they happened, they carried a weight of honesty that had been absent before. Daniel did not seek sympathy, nor did he assign blame elsewhere, because the record had spoken clearly enough, and living with that clarity became part of his responsibility. Across the same city, Alyssa Monroe continued her work with the same discipline that had guided her from the beginning, her role evolving as new projects demanded the same careful attention she had given before. She did not dwell on the outcome, because for her the value had always been in the process, in ensuring that systems designed to serve the public did so with integrity rather than assumption. Occasionally, she passed through neighborhoods like Maple Avenue, observing daily life unfold without recognition, and she welcomed that anonymity, knowing her impact was measured not in visibility, but in trust restored quietly over time. Reports were revised, training protocols updated, and oversight mechanisms strengthened, not as reactions to a single case, but as acknowledgments of lessons learned. Daniel followed these changes from a distance, recognizing their necessity, aware that reform often arrived only after discomfort forced awareness. He began attending community forums as a listener rather than a speaker, hearing perspectives he had once dismissed as anecdotal, now understanding how easily authority could silence experience when it refused to listen. Alyssa contributed to policy discussions when requested, offering insights grounded in data rather than opinion, careful to frame recommendations as safeguards rather than corrections. She believed that systems improved not through accusation, but through design that anticipated human bias and limited its reach. Time softened the sharp edges of the past, but did not erase memory, and that persistence became a quiet guide for both of them in different ways. Daniel learned that accountability was not a single event, but a practice sustained by humility, and Alyssa reaffirmed that justice was most effective when it arrived without spectacle. On an ordinary evening, as the city lights came on and traffic flowed steadily, Daniel paused at a crosswalk, watching people move past him with no awareness of his history, and felt a strange sense of resolve replace regret. Somewhere else, Alyssa closed another file, satisfied that accuracy had been preserved, knowing that the true measure of her work lay in what did not happen next. The law, once thought to belong to those who enforced it, revealed itself instead as something shaped by those willing to examine it honestly. In the end, the badge had not defined the truth, nor had silence hidden it, because truth did not need recognition to exist, only patience, precision, and the courage to be recorded exactly as it was.